Yeah, so this paper gets at a large literature that I wanted to kind of approach from a modeling perspective on War's inefficiency puzzle. So a lot of War's inefficiency puzzle comes out of cooperative game-theoretic solutions. So I'm going to discuss that modeling choice and what we get if we take a non-cooperative approach to solving the game. And by using the term game, I'm not taking conflict lightly. I'm just using as you guys know, the standard approach to understanding settings of strategic interdependence between two or more parties. Okay, so essentially, this is the abstract. What I want to do with this paper is to present a non-cooperative game that mimics Fearon's strategic setting, and I'll call that game fight or settle, and then I'll solve the game in that manner, in a non-cooperative manner. First, I wanted to talk a little bit about my background and kind of how I got into the conflict literature. So my dissertation was on 3 essays on the economics of conflict and contest, and so it was 2 parts conflict, 1 part sports contest methodology. So the unifying piece was the methodology. So I'm a contest theorist, and probably the 2 biggest applications in contest theory are conflict and contest. So you can use some similar approaches to model these settings, and you can really view sport as strategically as a setting of conflict, where conflict is any environment in which there are conflicting goals or goals that might be mutually exclusive across party. So the methodology was contest theory. Really the field for the first 2 chapters was political economy and public choice. So here's a little bit, a few of the articles I've written on in the area of conflict and also social choice. So on social choice aggregation, which is a subset, I would call, of the voting literature. So how do we aggregate from individual preferences to a choice for society, and what rules do we use? Okay, so let's get to the current project. Conflict is costly. This is something that Fearon pointed out. Parties put forth resources in an effort to win a conflict prize. Okay. However, despite its cost, we see conflict in myriad forms, such as litigation, such as armed conflict, and such as lobby contests in places like Washington. You can have these high-stakes lobby contests. And so we can see a long list of papers for each of these settings of conflict and contest. So the thing that Fearon pointed out that's so important and led, I think, largely led to this paradox of War's inefficiency puzzle is that conflict is costly, settlement is not substantially costly. Given these 2 stylized facts, we might ask why conflict of any kind exists. Okay, why do we see so many forms of conflict and so frequently? Yes, please.
So are you taking questions during your talk?
Yes, please.
So, why do we assume that settlement is not costly, right? I mean, if the transaction costs are really high, we expect less settlements, and isn't that kind of the theory behind why there are so many conflicts, litigation? Otherwise, people would just go to their neighbor's house and pay them to reduce the noise, the volume of their property,
right.
Like,
kind of a Coase theorem.
That's why we have lease and property rights and all these to reduce these transaction costs, but it's not perfect, right? So,
yeah, I think it's a really good point, and so I'm kind of going from Fearon's premise that maybe getting people to the table in maybe a setting of international conflict. Maybe it's costly, but maybe the costs are trivial relative to the actual conflict. So yeah, I don't believe it's costless. So I'm taking on an assumption in the literature, but I agree. A lot of times, yeah. For example, litigation can occur precisely because of transaction costs, and I think that's used in the litigation system to give people legal power. In some cases, small parties are a lot of times afraid of. They're afraid of litigation costs. So I agree with you. Settlement is sometimes very costly, and those transaction costs can create conflict. So I'm going to take on Fearon's assumption, but with the caveat that I agree with you. But when the stakes are high, when conflict costs are high, we still see conflict. So I think this is kind of the essential point that Fearon made, that even when it costs a lot less to fly some diplomats in and get at a peaceful resolution, we still see conflict. So what are some things that can create this? Yeah.
I developed a question through talking with you that is there and it's been in the back of my mind, is there a well-scrubbed database on the actual costs of war? Because you've got a lot of, armed armies, existing armies cost, and that's really a war cost as such.
The correlates of war data set is not exactly what you're talking about, but it does get at things that I've seen used proxied to proxy costs. So we know things like the value of a human life, so we have casualty data. So that might be, I've seen some work that views that as maybe proportional to the overall costs. I've also seen work on estimating the capital flight costs of especially interstate conflict. So I don't think there's a perfect data set for that, but I think there are some viable proxies.
Is it being developed like in the last 15, 20 years mostly?
The correlates of war goes back a little further than that, not much. In terms of how long it's been collected, it's a post-World War II data set. But so you could get at, through correlates of war, you could get proxies from after World War II.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
One other.
Oh, yes, please.
You'll probably get to this later.
Oh, yeah.
I'm jumping, let me know.
No.
Are we going to talk about how people are weighting the cost from conflict versus the cost from settlement? Because I feel like how different parties weigh the costs and benefits to each option is going to affect which one they choose to pursue. Yeah,
I'm not going to get into that. Yeah, I've put the weight on zero of the cost of settlement, obviously, which I think that's a valid point. That may not be true. I guess my main emphasis is going to be on the credibility of the solution and of Fearon's kind of solution, application of cooperative solution concepts. So a lot of hand waving, but I think the essential point will come down to, is this going to be a credible solution? Is this environment in which we can view a cooperative settlement as even feasible? I'm also going to introduce the idea of non-cooperative settlement, which may seem like kind of a paradox, but I'll define what I mean by non-cooperative settlement. And maybe you guys have seen some similar concepts. But in the context of literature, non-cooperative settlement is possible, and it's even defined, the conditions for that. Okay, so what Fearon does is he shows within a Nash bargaining model that expected party payoffs are higher under settlement than under conflict. And this kind of begs the question of why we're observing a lot of conflict. So I can distill Fearon's contribution or his main model down to a bargaining model plot. And so along this plot, what we want to focus on is if settlement is costless, then this is the Pareto efficient Nash bargaining line. These are all of the possible trades or settlement divisions we could achieve of the contest prize V. So this is the line at which the payoff to party 1 and party 2 is equal to V. So it's V minus, payoff to party 2 equals V minus payoff to party 1. And so if conflict is costless and this settlement can be achieved without transaction cost, then the threat point is the expected payoff to each party under conflict. But conflict has this cost, okay? So in this treatment, parties have the same probability of victory or the same proportion of the prize that they expect under conflict or under settlement, but they have to pay this nagging cost, okay? And so the Nash bargaining solution is that, well, if the threat point lies within this region, whose boundaries are the axes and the Pareto-efficient line, okay, then there exists, and the set is convex. I'm sorry, yeah, it's a convex set. Then we should be able to achieve a Nash bargaining solution. And actually, any of these points along this region are the viable bargaining range, because at any of these points, both sides would be better off. Like if I sat here, then party 1 would be better off from conflict. They would get this much as opposed to this much. Okay, but also if I was here, party 2 would be better off from conflict because they would get this much rather than this much. Okay, so these are mutually beneficial settlements compared to conflict. Okay, and so his main point was that we would expect to see parties settle every time under his assumptions rather than engage in conflict. Settlement division is Pareto superior to conflict division in the Nash bargaining game. That is, we can look at the payoff to each party, party 1 under settlement, under conflict, party 2 under settlement, under conflict, and we can form these strict inequalities that say that a settlement should be preferred. Okay. So settlement is not only preferred, but it is as Fearon shows, the cooperative Nash bargaining solution to the game. Okay. So if cooperative game theory can be used in a conflict setting, then the solution is settlement. Okay. And so this is Fearon's contribution. So then he asks, why is there so much conflict if this is the solution? Why can't an agreement be reached? As such, Fearon cannot account for the occurrence of conflict in a one-shot game setting, hence War's inefficiency puzzle. Okay, so then he creates some subsidiary models in his study, and he points to commitment problems and incomplete information as viable explanations for the occurrence of conflict. And I completely agree with Fearon that these are viable reasons that conflict may occur. So my point is going to be more of a way to model the one-shot game so that we can understand why conflict may occur in one-shot settings without introducing any ad hoc obstacles into our conflict setting. Okay. By the way, other reasons have come out of this literature subsequently, like indivisibilities and things like this. The conflict prize may be indivisible or not very well divisible. You can imagine. You can take like the Kashmir region of northern India, bordering between northern India and Pakistan. What's going on there is that both sides, it's very valuable to have upstream control of the Indus River Valley, right? So, and also you have this kind of lock and dam system that would make it less valuable if it was under shared control, okay? In some cases, half of something is not is not half as valuable as all of something. Okay, so if you wanted, I don't know, if you wanted the newspaper, if you wanted like half of my newspaper that I was reading, okay, I could give you a section of the newspaper or 2 sections, and you might be happy with that. But if I just took the newspaper and I tore it in half, vertically, that's not, that's probably not what you were going for, nor would you get half the value of just getting a newspaper. So, some things can be divided by sections cleanly. Some things, it's not really clear how to divide them or how you can divide them. So there are some really interesting solutions to War's inefficiency puzzle. We're going to focus on commitment problems, and we're going to go back to the one-shot game model and solve the game, it turns out non-cooperatively. Given commitment problems as defined by Fearon, so he defines commitment problems as, you have the absence of external enforcer of cooperative agreements. It is clear that Fearon uses what I would call an incorrect solution methodology, is what I'm going to argue, for the conflict settlement game. Okay, so this is not a setting for cooperative game theory. This is a setting, if you have a commitment problem, it's a setting for non-cooperative game theory. So what's the division between cooperative and non-cooperative game theory? We can say that cooperative game-theoretic solutions apply only in the presence of external enforcement, okay? And Nash bargaining, what he uses to solve this game is the chief example of a cooperative game-theoretic model, okay? So you can't have commitment problems and solve a game cooperatively. That solution is going to be non-binding, okay? When cooperative behavior cannot be externally enforced, who will enforce bargaining agreements? Sides can just do cheap talk in these cases. They can just cheap talk. They can say, "Oh yeah, we're committed to peace," and then they'll do what they want, if depending on their payoffs. Nash bargainings then do not constitute credible solutions to a game that lacks external enforcement of cooperative agreements. Given commitment problems, to the extent that these exist in conflict settings, if there is a commitment problem, then a non-cooperative game solution or a Nash equilibrium solution obtains. And so Nash actually created the chief solution methodology on both sides of game theory, cooperative and non-cooperative. Either way, we're solving this using Nash's work, but we're using a very different set of assumptions as to the game environment. Unlike cooperative game theory, non-cooperative game theory allows for the paradox of inefficient equilibrium outcomes. Okay, that's just a part of non-cooperative game theory. If you and I are independently making choices in a strategic setting, then we might get poor outcomes. Okay. Yes, in non-cooperative settings, players make decisions independently and often simultaneously. Maybe not chronologically simultaneously, but we consider any setting in which, when I act, I don't know what you chose. We consider that simultaneity, okay? So there's real trouble. There can be some real trust issues that arise in non-cooperative settings. I don't know what you're going to do, nor can I cooperatively help you decide what to do, and you help me in a binding manner. So settlements are possible in non-cooperative settings, but they must be arrived upon non-cooperatively or through independent choices, almost by chance, but not certainly through orchestration across parties. Such a non-cooperative settlement is credible in that there is no alternative means of settlement in the case of the one-shot game. So how a non-cooperative settlement occurs is that essentially we've both handcuffed ourselves and said, okay, we've independently and simultaneously said, okay, I'm not arming for this. I'm going to commit to a settlement, okay, because I think that's what's best for me. And then you independently say the same thing. And then we have no other recourse for, in a one-shot game, there's just no other recourse for division. It's got to be settlement division. It can't be conflict division. Okay, we've chosen pens over swords irrevocably in that case. So herein we demonstrate a non-cooperative equilibrium analysis of Fearon's game setting within a stylized discrete choice game. This is not the only setting in which we can demonstrate this result, this set of results. We can demonstrate this for proper continuous choice contest models. But I thought this would be a little kind of clearer exposition. Okay, so this is generalizable, but it's kind of a stylized game. So we're going to call this game Fight or Settle. It's designed to mimic Fearon's central model. There are two parties, each seeking the same prize, for example, a territory, and we call that prize a common valuation prize. So each party just values the prize at V, or you can even normalize the prize value to 1. Okay. Each party can A, arm and fight for the resource, or B, not arm and offer to settle. Okay, so these are my choices. I have a binary action or strategy set. I can arm and get ready for a fight, but arming is kind of a specific. It's kind of a specific strategy. It's conflict-related arming or mobilization for this particular conflict. Or B, I can not arm and offer to settle. Okay, so let's just let the prize be worth $1, okay? Not really, maybe empirically valid, but we can allow for a normalization of the prize to $1. Further, we let arming to fight cost 25 cents, so it's a quarter. So you either arm or you don't. And if you arm, it costs a quarter of the prize value. And that's a private cost. Those are your arms, that's your cost. We let settlement be costless, or at least you can say maybe epsilon, compared to that quarter of the prize value. Maybe settlement is either 0 or just trivial in our model. The arming cost is taken to be sunk, okay? Think of a combat training cost or a deployment cost. Okay, once you get your guys on the border, you've paid the cost, or you've trained your guys, you've paid the cost. So those are irrevocable within the model. Yes?
I was thinking of the Department of State and the costs that could be assigned to a settlement growing out of staffing at the Department of State, and I can believe that they're epsilon compared to what military costs are. Because state, I think, has like 10 or 12,000 employees, or 8 to 12,000 or something like that. And the armies are, really high, like Air Force is like, I think, 220,000. So I'm not really arguing that. It's just that setting it at 0 does a disservice to the future to me in terms of actually budgeting for diplomacy. Right.
Yeah, and I agree with you. I'm adopting Fearon's. I don't mean to blame him. I don't know him, so he's easy to blame. But I'm kind of adopting. I'm trying to mimic his game. But I will say you could set those at 24 or 24% of the value of the prize and get the same result that I'm going to get. You get the same equilibrium. So then you would have a settlement costs 96% as much as the conflict, and you would get the same result. You would get, spoiler alert, you'd get inefficient conflict. Yeah. So it's just really the order of those costs that's going to be important in this stylized game, and moreover in the more generalized contest game. But I agree with you, and I think I should probably have some cost term for settlement within the paper. I think that's been actually a really good point by both of you. I just want to note that real quick. Okay. Okay, so parties choose simultaneously and independently from their respective binary action sets. Action sets in one-shot games, a lot of times action sets are are the same as strategy sets. Okay, it's just what you can do. In this case, you can fight or you can settle. Okay, you can buy into arming, or you can settle. But you might already anticipate what's going on if you choose settlement. You may be leaving yourself exposed if the other side chooses fight. And this is the trick about non-cooperative game theory. You can get into some real trust issues because, well, if the other side arms and I don't, the payoffs may be against me in that case. This conflict is symmetric. If both parties choose to fight, then the outcome is a coin flip. Okay. Again, not empirically valid, and we could asymmetrize the game and obtain the same equilibrium. If a single party chooses fight, the outcome is deterministic in favor of that party. So this is important. I'm not imposing this. This is a characteristic of a standard contest success function, okay? If I choose even epsilon arms, even just one sword at the border, and you don't, then according to the contest success function, I will deterministically win the prize, okay? This isn't going to really matter to the solution. Neither of the cases in which I arm and you don't, or vice versa, neither of these cases are going to be any sort of equilibrium behavior, but it is a part of contest theory. If neither party chooses fight, a settlement division is achieved without recourse. Okay, so there is really no recourse is the common interpretation. Neither of us have armed. We either sit down and settle, or through, in this case, in this symmetric model, through fair division, we just split it in half. Or there's just no other allocation possible. Okay, so this is the normal form of the game. So it's a 2x2 game, 2 players, symmetric. Okay, and so what we have in the margins are just the possible actions that the players can take. Okay, this is player one's possible actions. So player one is kind of thinking vertically between fight or settle, thinking about first payoffs for each outcome, and trying to maximize that first payoff. Okay. Independently, party two is thinking horizontally between fight and settle, thinking about second payoffs, and trying to maximize that second payoff. And they're both trying to maximize their respective payoffs through best response. So the key to Nash equilibrium is this notion of best response. I'm going to form a best response to anything you could possibly do. And so actually the Nash equilibrium is going to be an intersection point of best responses. Okay, all possible parties, in this case both parties, are in best response. Okay, so the payouts are set up to mimic kind of a continuous choice contest game. Okay, so how do we interpret this 2x2 table? I'm sure some of you know how to interpret continuous choice, discrete choice, but I didn't want to assume that, so I added this slide in to just try to help make sure everyone's on the same page before we analyze the game. So what this is saying is that if both parties choose to settle, they achieve a costless split of the prize. Each player's payoff is 0.5. Okay, so it's the intersection of party one settles. Okay, party two settles. We get party one gets 0.5, party two gets 0.5. If both parties choose to fight, they achieve a costly split of the prize. In expectation, each player's payoff is fixed along the first row, and player two can get 0.25 payoff from fighting or a 0 payoff from settling. Okay, so 0.25 is greater than 0. They're going to choose to fight under that scenario. And so we draw an arrow left to show that the best response for player two is to fight in that case. If player two thinks that player one will choose settle, then player two can get 0.5 from settling, or 0.75 from fighting. 0.75 is greater than 0.5. Under that scenario, also they would choose fight, and so we draw a left arrow. So for both player 1 and player 2 in this game, fight is a dominant strategy. Okay, so under games in which both parties have a dominant strategy, we're assured a single unique pure strategy Nash equilibrium, and that occurs at fight, or at the intersection of these dominant strategies. So the Nash equilibrium of this game is that both sides are going to arm and fight, and that's how the division is going to be. And it doesn't matter that this Pareto dominates this outcome. It doesn't matter that settle. The payoffs associated with that Pareto dominate. The payoffs associated with fight. Non-cooperatively, they choose the inefficient outcome through a rational process. Okay, so this is the kind of paradox that I'm talking about, and this gets at a class of games called Tragedy of the Commons or Prisoner's Dilemma games, in which you can get these paradoxes. Yeah.
I've been thinking a lot about the lack of human life cost in the taking of human life in war, and between the lack of a justifiable compensation. I don't know that there's ever existed a war where the families of loss get compensated adequately. And also that the infrastructure losses, as well as trade in a conflict, are never really individualized. So you really don't have, I think, a really historic costing of the true costs of conflict. And so what I'm arguing, I'm trying to play the devil's advocate, that your numbers up there really do not fairly reflect anywhere near the costs of war. They might reflect the staging or the strategy of war, and the arming for war, and the value of land. But I maintain they in no way reflect the long-term multi-generational family losses, nor the infrastructure and trade losses, which I think are huge. And you might, what they call it in accounting, when it's set aside as there's a term for it, below the third triple line. It's I can't think of the name, but it's a cost that is just like borne by society, but isn't recognized on the balance sheet.
Right. So, yeah, and I agree with you. I will say, and this isn't in disagreement to you at all, that as long as, in this model, as long as the cost is less than 1/2, the private cost is less than 1/2 the prize valuation, then you would get the same result, as long as you don't consider the earlier point you guys raised, which was settlement costs. So actually,
externalized cost is what the term that I was thinking.
Right. So there's a little wiggle room to this result. If the costs are more than half, and it's another good point. If the costs are more than half, you would the private costs to each side are more than half. You wouldn't have conflict, because essentially what would happen is, you would have a negative net payoff from conflict. So you would choose settlement in that case. Now, you wouldn't have that problem. That wouldn't generalize to the continuous choice game, in which I can choose any level of arms. I don't just buy in for a quarter of the prize. I can buy any level. I can buy 0.01, 0.001 the value of the prize, 0.0001 the proportion of the prize. So if there's continuity, that I can buy in for a penny or a pound, I wouldn't have this problem. But the problem you raised, that it might be sensitive to costs, it does affect this discrete choice game. Yet you couldn't have too high of costs and still get conflict settlement. So, I mean, it might actually be a good thing. If your interest is peace, then it might be a good thing to have these high costs if you have a more discrete form game. And
the problem there is that I see is that the rewards, you might get the costs, but there might be rewards to the private sector, like armament. So the costs are still there, but the force of going ahead is a special interest. still exists very heavily in terms of there being an owner of a win.
Yep.
The whole ownership isn't a win, but the special interest is a big win.
Yep. Yeah,
I
that's a good point.
follow up. So I think the assumption of this model is that the player is a unitarist player. So for country case, for example, for territory disputes, so player one country, player two country, but each player there's many sub players.
Yeah.
So for example, for special interest groups, so I think the behavior of each player is not depend on the calculation of this payoff matrix, but their inside sub players payoff matrix.
Right. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, I agree. And this is kind of a tradition in contest modeling and conflict modeling, using the contest approach to say that these V terms, these V sub I terms, are the result of a social aggregation of preferences feeding into the decision maker. So the decision maker ultimately assigns the valuation of the conflict, but taking into account through the political process or the bureaucratic process, as it were in some countries, taking into account these sorts of or aggregating these sorts of preferences. Now that's not to say that that's a perfect way to do it, but that's the assumption that's been made, and I think you raise a valid point. So I think you would have to go two-stage to do what you're saying. So you would have to have some, in the first stage of the game, you'd have to have some aggregation of preferences. Maybe it's like similar to a lobbying contest. But then in the second stage, the first stage is to assign a V sub I, a valuation for the conflict for that side. And then in the second stage, you have the actual conflict or settlement. So the tradition in the contest literature is to kind of wave your hand at the first stage, but that doesn't mean that I think that doesn't mean there can't be interesting models that focus on the first stage or the effect of the first on the second. So I think that's a very very nice point. Because as you guys know, I mean, you study voting, you study social choice aggregation. You can have a high valuation for something in some sectors and among some interest groups within a society, but the ultimate decision goes against those kind of high concentrated interests. Sometimes you can have some broad. You don't have really a strong interest in something, but it might be broad enough, or the distribution might be such that the decision is made based on those less distilled interests. So the way in which these V sub I's get assigned, I think, is really interesting. I'm sure in a lot of countries, if your country especially goes is in a conflict situation that you don't agree with, maybe you want to tell people, that wasn't my decision. So I think the whole, V sub I is not necessarily representative of, it's representative of the aggregation, preference aggregation rules that are used in that society, but not necessarily the broad preferences of the society. Yeah, really good point. So we have the Nash equilibrium in the game at fight. It's a unique equilibrium, even though settle would raise expected payoff for each party. Okay, so and so here's then what I have to say about Fearon's central model. If we solve the conflict settlement game non-cooperatively, we find that there is no puzzle in Fearon's central one-shot conflict settlement model. When cooperative behavior is externally enforced, a Nash bargaining solution obtains, or settlement obtains. So when it's not externally enforced, a non-cooperative Nash equilibrium solution, conflict obtains. So sometimes in life we get conflict, and sometimes we get settlement, and I don't think this is the whole story, but it might in some cases, or many cases even, come down to whether or not we have that external enforcement. So I think that the big contribution of this stylized non-cooperative solution to Fearon's original game is to say that, well, external enforcement might be really important, and it might be centrally important. If we're assured conflict in its absence, and we're assured settlement in its presence, then it looks like an important variable. So can we get it? Does that mean we can get it? Well, institutions do matter, but it's definitely something. It's definitely something that might be central to the outcome. Non-cooperative game theory, I'll say in general, is often quite descriptive of conflict settings. Of course, conflict and cooperation are typically viewed as opposite extremes. Okay, so it's if you're considering going to conflict to someone, it might be difficult. If you don't have a governing body externally to get cooperation. Okay, so I have 2 daughters, so I'm sure that if I'm not around, they behave much differently than toward each other than if I'm around. So this might be without the external enforcement. It might be very difficult to go from here to here in a lot of cases. It's not just like they're not neighbors. I get they're not neighboring outcomes. They're really, really far apart in a lot of cases. Parties to potential conflict don't typically trust one another and therefore typically make decisions independently, even if this can mean saying one thing and doing another. Okay, so you might get a lot of nice talk, but at the end of the day, it's what game theorists call cheap talk. Okay, if there's not someone looking over my shoulder, if there's not credible enforcement, I'm not necessarily going to do what I say. Yes, please.
I just want to be cognizant of time. We only have a couple minutes left, so I want to make sure that the presenters has time to.
Oh yeah. I think I will. Yeah. I want to. I don't want to go against the theme of a conversation, so I'd like to take it. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to say. So, what about credible threats in the absence of enforcement?
Yeah. So I will say, from a modeling standpoint, the threat is credible if in their payoffs it can be a best response to something, or if they've just handcuffed themselves. Like trying to think of
like an arms race. That's a kind of form of non-cooperative cooperation.
Yeah.
Like that.
Yeah, and
the costs of that are also really high, but then it needs to settle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm gonna have to think about that more, but I think that is. So there's this part of game theory, part of non-cooperative game theory called strategic commitments. Okay, so I can do something that changes the payoffs of the game, and I think what you're talking about is one of those examples. It's almost to force, if I'm kind of at the metagame level, I'm a player in the game, but I want to get to the metagame level. I can do something. It might even be something to constrain myself that might change the payoffs of the game and non-cooperatively force a cooperative outcome. And I think credible threats certainly fall in that category. Kind of a strategic commitment. Yeah, and it's a very good point. It's certainly something that could be developed. I haven't seen something specific to that, but it's something that could, I think, be developed along related lines. Okay, so I'll try to finish up quickly. Pareto-dominated profiles such as fight can be Nash equilibria or chosen behaviors. On the other hand, profiles that Pareto dominate other profiles may not be Nash equilibria. This is because players choose independently and do not necessarily trust one another. So as I said before, this is a whole class of games called Tragedy of the Commons or Prisoner's Dilemma games, that explain myriad behaviors, such as clear-cutting forests and things like this, environmental travesties, and overfishing is a type of tragedy of the commons games. These are really two ways of explaining the same type of game outcome. This is just with more specific setting for common pool resource games. Okay, and this is a little more general. Any type of setting in which you can get an inefficient Nash equilibrium. So there's a whole class of these types of games. They characterize many conflict settings and many game settings. In such games, players have trust issues, leading to an innate conflict between what is chosen and what is best for the parties of the game. Okay, and then there's some references, some resources. I wanted to, in case there are some students looking for some, and I'm sure you know about these, but or you know about this one for sure. I really like this text. I think it's the best text for a political scientist interested in game theory. It's a little dated, but then again, introductory game theory doesn't date very quickly. Here's something I put together for my game theory courses. So recently, a publisher, I proposed to publish the book, and a textbook publisher offered to publish it, but I didn't like their price point, so I'm going to keep it as a PDF. I didn't want the students to have to pay this enormous. It's not. I wasn't saying it was too low. Like I want to, but so I'm going to keep it as a PDF, and I can give you this upon request. I'll give you my email address at the end. Yeah, and then this is also something you can get online as a PDF. Paul Johnson. So of course, James Morrow is at University of Michigan. He's a political scientist. Paul Johnson is at University of Kansas. He's a political scientist there. Very interested in voting systems and social voting aggregation and these types of issues. So I think to answer your question, you would model from this book and then into this book. I think that has the two-stage model that you were suggesting very nicely. And of course, Morrow gets at both of these sides of political science. So I think these are some nice references, some nice resources. I can tell you how to find this online. For some reason, he took it down. I have a copy. It's always been open source, but I have a copy. And if not, you can do a Google search to find it. But and I think that's all. Yeah, please.
Just real quick, we are about out of time, so I do want to make sure you give a round of applause.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks.